So I want to talk to you tonight about how sweeping, and we might even say revolutionary, changes in law and politics happen, and about how we often don't think enough systematically about the roles that ordinary citizens play in producing them. So I want to begin with a story that got me thinking about this topic. I split my time between New York and New Haven, and one weekend I was in New York having dinner with some friends. We were sitting at a bar, and the two friends of mine started, I think, flirting with one another, and I decided that I should talk to the bartender. And the bartender told me that he was a member of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I said, wow, I live 2 blocks away, and I don't know enough about you. I wish that I could talk more to more folks in your movement. So I said, you know, you ought to bring more cocktails to this movement, because I think that could be really great. And he sort of gave me a very serious look, and I thought, okay, this is a serious guy. So I tried to be lawyerly, and I said to him, so what are the specific policies that you're looking to produce? And he said, oh, no, man, you don't get it. So I said, okay, so you're looking to take down policies rather than produce new ones. And he said, no, you don't get it. We've got to get rid of the entire system. I said, the system of making policies, the system of government, what are you talking about? And he said, yeah, the entire system. So I said, you're talking about anarchy. He said, no, and he looked at me seriously and said, anarchy's so 1985. And I mean, I was born in 1985, and sometimes my living room looked a lot like anarchy, so I could see what he was saying. So then I said, well, maybe what you're talking about is a type of system where everyone contributes, where we get rid of representative democracy and have direct democracy. You know, we could all Skype in our votes on every issue. And he said, no, Skype's the devil. He said, you're just not getting it. So this made me think a lot about what it means to have a young, raw movement. And obviously, this person, this bartender, doesn't represent the Occupy Wall Street movement, but he is a part of this new movement that's trying to get off the ground. And in my current day job, I write about movements of another era. So I started thinking, how can we think more about the successful features of movements that actually produce legal change, and what makes them successful? So I'm currently writing about the New Deal and about social movements in the New Deal. And as I started to think back, I thought, you know, there are features of these movements that we can take in the present and really use to make sense of how legal change happens and what makes movements successful and how movements can grow and build, whether it's Occupy or the Tea Party or any other movement. So I want to tell you a few stories about the New Deal, and I want to talk about 4 movements, and I want to talk about 4 features and approaches that these movements used, with the inkling that they are sort of enduring and can tell us something about the present. So to set the scene, I want to begin in 1932 and end in 1938. And in 1932, we're on the brink of the Great Depression, and FDR had just been elected president, and he got a sea of letters from workers. One of them said, truly, Mr. President, there's such a thing as economic slavery. Now, what they were talking about was the fact that workers at that time didn't have a minimum wage. They didn't have unemployment compensation or Social Security. They didn't have the right to bargain collectively together. That children were still working in factories. Indeed, when FDR was campaigning for a second term in 1936, he was in Bedford, Massachusetts, and a young girl came through the crowd and tried to speak to him. And when that young girl came through the crowd, a police officer tried to stop her. And FDR said, no, let her through. And she'd written him a letter. And in this letter, this young girl talked about the working conditions of her and the 200 other young girls who worked at her factory. Their wages had just been cut in half. They worked horrible, insufferable hours. And she said, Mr. President, I wish you could do something to help us. Well, the truth was, at the time, not a lot of people were confident that something would be done or even could be done. So what happens between 1932 and 1938 is that all of these things actually are done. Workers gain the right to bargain collectively with their employers. They gain Social Security for when work stops and unemployment compensation for when work stops. They gain minimum wages. Child labor is prohibited in this country. So the question is, what caused this revolution? And we have our heroes in this story, typically. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his fantastic Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. The senators like Robert Wagner, who helped push these things through. But we don't think systematically enough about what ordinary citizens do and did. And they did more than bring letters to the president on the campaign trail. So I want to talk to you about 4 movements. The American Federation of Labor, which struggled for collective bargaining rights for workers. The National Consumers League, a league of mostly middle-class women from New York City who struggled to end child labor and for minimum wage laws. The Wisconsinites, a group of academics from Wisconsin who struggled for Social Security and other legislation like that. And finally, the Townsenites, a group mostly of the elderly who didn't have Social Security and who were struggling for old age pensions. So what did these four movements do? And I want to talk about the 4 C's today: chipping, charging, chaining, and changing the wind. So chipping is about the long, hard work that movements do over time. It's about not succeeding but still pushing on, building infrastructure and maintaining it when things are fast and great as well as when they're slow and hard. So the American Federation of Labor began in 1886 and pushed for the right of workers to collectively bargain for decades, often facing obstacles from the court, often having the small legislation that was put in place knocked down. Similarly, the Wisconsinites and the National Consumers League put in state legislation prohibiting child labor, giving minimum wages, again, seeing it knocked down time and time again. And yet they chipped and they chipped and they chipped over time for decades, and people had a sense that they were there and that there were citizens mobilized to do these things. But chipping alone often isn't enough. So I also want to talk about charging. Charging is about when movements find an opening, find a moment, and try to ramp up their efforts and charge on through. So for example, in 1934, the American Federation of Labor knew that they were close to getting a collective bargaining guarantee through Congress. And what they did at that time was that they had this volcanic summer of strikes and protests, struggling for the right of collective bargaining, because they knew that the timing was good. And the next fall, when Congress reconvened, they listened. The legislative history of that year, which produced the act, is chock full of messages about the labor movement's charge. Similarly, when a piece of legislation almost got through providing child labor prohibitions and the minimum wage, the National Consumers League understood that it was stuck in a committee and that it would pass but for the fact that it was stuck in this committee. And it was reticent Southern congressmen who didn't think that it might get through, or who didn't think that their constituents would favor the bill. So the National Consumers League produced this charge in the South. They worked with local organizations to get Southern senators on board. They called their senators and had letters come through from the South. And this charge was really key to getting the prohibition of child labor and to getting the minimum wage. I also want to talk about chaining. Chaining is about how movements connect. They connect to other movements, to government, and even connect themselves to ideas and ideals. So the first example of chaining is about how movements connect to other movements, which can be really important for them to build up steam. So we just talked about how the National Consumers League had this drive in the South to get minimum wage and child labor prohibitions. But what I didn't say was that they were able to do this because they had chained on to all of these local movements in the South for quite some time. And they had all of these local allies across the country that they were connected to and that they could mobilize to get legislation through. Chaining is also about how movements connect to government. So one great example of this was when a man from the labor movement was driving around a senator from Nebraska who was campaigning in Pennsylvania. And this man had been injured in the mines, and he said to the senator, "This is what I've been through, this is my story, and I'm a member of the labor movement." And this senator was George Norris, and George Norris became incredibly attracted to the labor movement's cause and became one of their advocates in government. So there's a lot of work that movements do to testify at hearings, to get senators on their side, and to sort of break the membrane between themselves and government, and to have a say within government, which can be important. And the third way in which this happens is that movements chain onto ideas, and they try to embody them. So the 13th Amendment, which came out of the Civil War and banned slavery, the labor movement said it also banned wage slavery. And they said that the guarantees of freedom in the 13th Amendment applied to their cause, and they became associated with this idea. So chaining is about how movements connect to other movements, to government, to ideas, in order to become more than they are themselves. And finally, I want to talk about changing the wind, which is sort of the most amorphous, but it's really important. And a movement changes the wind when they're able to take something that wasn't on the table and push it on the table. So they're able not just to get the passionate, to put it crudely, not just to get the passionate crazies like them engaged, but also to get the lazies engaged, and to really get the average person in the country involved in what they're doing. And one great example of this in the New Deal is the Blue Ribbon Campaign. So what happened was that the labor movement played a key role in making sure that every business that supported labor's cause put a blue ribbon on the storefront window. And countless businesses across the country did this. They put blue ribbons on the window, and then they had this big march through New York City. 250,000 people went through the streets of New York City supporting the Blue Ribbon Campaign. And it was this great moment when you could feel the wind changing in the country, when you could feel that the movement had reached out to ordinary Americans and gotten them on their side. So I know we're talking about these 4 C's here, and I'm sure this is looking like none of the report cards of people in the room, but how do we make sense of them together? So I think the first 2, chipping and charging, are about balance. So chipping is about long, hard work, it's about the marathon, and charging is about the sprint, right? Just like chaining is about getting passionate advocates on your side, and changing the wind is about getting ordinary citizens on the movement side. And in this way, these 2 C's together sort of work in this great manner. So one way of thinking about this is about the toolbox that successful movements use, that these movements reach out to government, they reach out to other movements, they have infrastructure when things are bad, but they're also pushing when they know there's a moment of leverage. And I think this toolbox is useful for current movements, but I also think that there's something from the era that we can keep in mind as we move forward and think about the future of work and workers' rights in America. And that's an argument that these workers made, and it was about the argument between the relationship between work and self-government. So what does that mean? Well, these workers didn't want to tear down their workplace hierarchies. They didn't want to get rid of their bosses or stop working for the corporations they work for. But what they did want to do was that they wanted to ensure that when they went into work, they went in as self-governing people. So when workers wanted to band together with other workers to govern themselves and to say that this is our will and we want to be able to form it together and translate that to employers, that was a form of deliberation, of agency that they exercised together in the workplace as self-governing people. And they also made a tie between the idea of self-government and democracy. So they said that we need forms of collective security at work and when work stops in order to be the types of people that democracies need. We need unemployment compensation for when work stops so we're not cast into dire poverty. We need social security so that old age isn't such a condition of dire poverty. We need minimum wages so that we're able to build lives of our own apart from the workplace. And all of this was about the conditions of collective security that allow people to make life plans and to have stability and to both go into work with them and to leave work without them. And really, what all of these movements during this era were doing was saying that self-government as American ideal wasn't just about the boxes that we check at the polls every 4 years, but was also about the way that we live our day-to-day lives in work and beyond work. So I think that we can not only learn from the successes of the movements of the New Deal in the techniques and the toolbox that they use, but also from some of their animating ideals that we can keep with us as we think about self-government in the future. And one germ of this future is the way that some workplaces in this country are changing. So for example, there are workplaces like Google, where employees spend 28% of their time on self-generated creative projects. And there are what scholars call flattened workplaces, where workers aren't quite in the same confined roles and hierarchies they were before, where people contribute beyond the narrow range and take on more responsibilities within the workplace. And I think these are good germs of the future for what we can think about when we think about the future of workers' rights in the country. But really, I think what these movements show us is that the long, hard work of producing sweeping legal change has to have a short game as well as a long game. And I think that these movements are incredible movements for us to think about when we think about the work that is to come to make work decent in America. Thank you.